Well, greetings and welcome. Thank you so much for introducing yourselves in the chat and where you're coming from. It's great to see that from all over the US and hopefully the world, folks are joining in for this Wednesday witness. My name is Laura Kigueva James. I serve as the Director of Grassroots Organizing at the General Board of Church and Society of the United Methodist Church, and I'll be your host for this mini series titled A Wednesday Witness, A Call to Social Holiness. As you know, and I'm sure you can feel, these are tumultuous times in the US and around the world. And as people of faith, we are called to respond. Last week, through our Justice Talk series, we engaged in a conversation on activating hope. And in this virtual mini-series, we want to give you tangible steps to put that hope into action. So in the next month, we'll be highlighting current issues that we're working on at Church and Society to equip you to take specific action to create change in your local communities. All these sessions will be recorded and available for later viewing on our YouTube page. And we encourage you during this time as you listen to share questions that you have, either live on our Facebook page or here in the chat on the webinar. And also, if you have further questions about this series, please email us at gbcs@umcjustice.org. So now let's dive into this Wednesday witness. So as people of faith, we often ask ourselves, well, should we engage in politics? Isn't there a law on separation of church versus the state? Yes, and we are called to be a witness. Our church's social teachings and principles state that while declaring our ultimate allegiance to God, Scripture recognizes that faithfulness to God requires political engagement by the people of God. And our social principle, 164B, says that the strength of a political system depends upon the full willing participation of its citizens. As United Methodists, our social teachings and principles affirm our theology and identity as God's people to be civically engaged. John Wesley writes that there is no religion but social, no holiness but social holiness. As people of faith, we do not exist by ourselves, but we live socially in relationship with God, each other, and all creation. So this is our call to social holiness, our collective witness, living out our faith. We welcome you to this series. I'm going to continue to invite you to introduce yourselves. Where are you coming from? What's your local church in the chat? So today we're going to be talking about voting rights. And I'm joined by Reverend Kendall McBroom, the Director of Civil and Human Rights, and Dr. Jesse Smith, the Senior Executive Director of Research Planning and Spiritual Formation at the General Board of Church and Society. So excited to have my colleagues here. All right, are we all together? Gonna make sure we're in the space. Are we all pinned together, Larry? Just want to check in with my tech. Good. I think we're in gallery view. Okay. So today we're going to be talking about voting rights, as I said, and as United Methodists, we have been advocating for years for the right to safe, free, and fair elections from El Salvador, Democratic Republic of Congo, the Philippines, and many other countries. And more recently, here in the US, we have seen significant restrictions to the right to vote. So in the US in 2020, over 400 new voter restriction laws and proposals were introduced in 49 states. And as people of faith, we continue to mobilize and organize in the face of this injustice and call for the right to free, fair, and safe elections. And as we move towards the 2022 midterms in the US, we need to amplify this call. So I'm excited to have my colleague, Reverend McBroom and Dr. Smith here. And I invite you, can you all share more about the current state of voting rights in the US and why, as a faith community, are we called to advocate for free, fair, and safe elections? Kendall, Reverend McBroom, I'm gonna pass it to you.
All right. Thank you, Reverend James, Laura James, for this opportunity. And it's so good to see all of the people coming in from the different parts of the world. I see many from the US, but others throughout the world. So it's so good to see that. So the current state of voting rights right now, it goes back to 2013 when the US Supreme Court, in a way, made a ruling that gutted a significant part of the Civil Rights Act of 1965. And in that act, there was a preclearance for states who had a history of discrimination, a history of voter suppression. Those states had to have their elections, have their processes, their voting laws cleared by the federal government, by the DOJ. And so we see in the gutting of that, as Reverend James mentioned, those 400 laws that were restrictive and voter suppression, if you will. And so we saw that take place in 2020 and from 2013, and then just seeing it in 2020. And then with a number of laws, a number of things and other activities that states and localities have done that really have limited access to the ballot and restricted full participation by the electorate, eligible voters, to be able to access the polls. And so voting rights right now is in a state of a very dangerous state, if you will. We'll just say that, a very dangerous state. As many of us know, the John R. Lewis Act, Voting Rights Act, was going to modernize that pre-clearance procedure. It had the hopes of modernizing elections, and so states who had about 10 voting rights violations, were going to have to get pre-clearance in a 25, if they had that within a 25-year span. And so they were going to have to obtain clearance from the DOJ. But unfortunately, we know that law did not pass, that legislation did not pass, which was very unfortunate because that would have helped secure our elections. That would have helped secure individuals' access to the ballot. And so with that being said, that's the current state of play. We're in a dire situation, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Smith.
Thanks, Reverend McBurnham. I really appreciate that framing. And I would say, yeah, the part that I want to lift up is twofold. One is the current state of the Supreme Court decisions that have come out, and then how the 2020 census actually has impacted where we are today. So in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, as Reverend McBurnham noted, there were these efforts to try to eliminate racial disparities that impact the right to vote in our communities. It's about ensuring that the outcome of a process leads to successful elections. So then comes along 2013, Shelby v. Holder, and that creates some significant impacts, especially it impacts recent redistricting efforts in states. Part of the work of the decennial census is to give states updated information about their communities and whether population shifts impact both the number and nature of a state's voting districts. Many United Methodists were active in their communities to promote the count in the 2020 census, particularly in communities that have been historically undercounted in the previous counts. Unfortunately, these same communities, including Indigenous communities, Latino, Hispanic, and Black communities, were undercounted again. Alabama, North Carolina, Louisiana, and Georgia, all states that previously were under that pre-clearance provision of the Voting Rights Act that Reverend McBroom talked about, redrew their state's voting districts after the 2020 census in ways that have been challenged in court. So in other words, this was the first time that maps were being redrawn around voting districts since the 2013 Shelby v. Holder decision had happened. So that's sort of why 2013 has now impacted 2020 and beyond with respect to redistricting. Last Tuesday, June 26th, we saw that the Supreme Court put a stay on a case from Louisiana, Ardoin v. Robinson, in which civil rights organizations filed a federal lawsuit against the Secretary of State of Louisiana. They argued that a newly drawn map of voting districts dilutes the vote of Black voters. The federal redistricting passed by the Louisiana state legislature had drawn districts such that 5 out of 6 of their districts were white voter majority. Only one district drawn reflected a majority Black voting district. Lower courts deemed this discriminatory on the basis of race and violated Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The court called on the state to adopt a new congressional plan that included 2 districts of majority Black voters. The stay by the Supreme Court means, however, that the lower court's decision is effectively put on hold, and that the 2022 elections this year will proceed under a map with 2 areas of majority Black voters being placed into one voting district. The Supreme Court agreed to hear a similar Alabama case, Merrill v. Milligan, that will likely determine whether Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act will be upheld or not. That case will hear arguments in early October. What this means is that the very heart of the Voting Rights Act is being considered by the Supreme Court in a very consequential way this fall. Additionally, the court agreed on June 30th of this year to hear a case out of North Carolina, Moore v. Harper. This is a case that looks at what is called the independent state legislature theory that says under the Constitution, only the legislature has the power to regulate federal elections without interference from state courts. It is also likely to be heard this fall with a decision early next year. So with that background in mind, I want to say that this should not discourage us from engaging the electoral process, but rather should animate us to become even more active participants. The outcome of this year's midterm elections will be critical for determining the future of our communities. We know that the right to vote isn't just an issue that is going to affect who and how we vote, but also impacts the critical issues facing our communities: climate, poverty, healthcare, peace. So in this year of midterm elections, it is imperative that we stand up as responsible and active participants in the democratic process and support our neighbors and communities in the critical effort to vote.
Thank you so much, Kendall and Jesse, for the breadth of identifying this reality that connects, specifically to the US, but is deeply in relationship with our brothers and sisters across the world. So just want to name that it's not an either or, but this continues our witness for fighting for free, fair, and safe elections. So we have set the context, but now here is our time to act. So I'm going to share my screen beautifully, if this can happen. Perfect. Okay, so we have 4 specific actions for you today. First, you can preach and teach, even this Sunday, next Sunday, through the rest of the summer, leading up into the 2022 midterm elections. We have our incredible civic engagement toolkit that you can use in your local context, specifically the 1-pager on the electoral process that really helps you as a congregation to speak really what is the church's role in engaging the electoral process and what are the do's and don'ts. I know a lot of churches have questions around like, what can we do as a church? And all of the answers are there. So we encourage you to go to our website, umcjustice.org, and visit that resource, the Civic Engagement Toolkit. I saw another question about which state does not have restrictions, and that is really good because there was 49 states, so this question about what was the one. So you can go to votingrightslab.org. That covers all of the states, specifically in the US, and shows the voting restrictions that have been passed and that have not been passed. So if you want to go in depth into your local context on a state level, that's a great nonpartisan resource that has really all of that state-by-state information at your fingertips. The next thing that you can do is to call your senators, specifically call your senators to protect the right to vote, as well as the integrity of the vote that addresses racial inequities. Thank you so much, Dr. Smith, for bringing up that reality of how the right to vote is directly impacting communities of color and how we can address that by protecting the right to vote. And so you can call your senators today. That number goes directly to the congressional operating system. All you have to do is share with them your state and they will connect you directly to your senator. I did it today and I'm going to do it again because it's so important for us to protect this right to vote. And lastly, register. So that link, vote.gov, goes directly to a national page that will take you to your state electoral page where you can make sure that you're registered to vote and get other folks registered. That is so important. So thank you so much for participating today. I have one question for you all. We have given you 4 ways to engage. And so please drop in the chat, what are you going to do? You know, Reverend Kendall, Dr. Smith, myself, we've given you incredible content. We've also given you ways to engage. So please drop in the chat how you're going to particularly respond to this call to action, to this witness of our social holiness of United Methodists. So thank you. I see all of these great things coming in the chat. How are folks you're going to use the toolkit. You're going to get out the vote. Yes, educate and call. Using the toolkit, wonderful. We're going to follow up with you. We had over 400 people register, so we're going to follow up and see how you are going to be engaged today. Before we end, definitely want to say thank you to our tech person, Larry, for holding it down on the Facebook, as well as getting us together here on the Zoom. Thank you so much to Dr. Smith and Reverend Kendall, and thank you, Reverend McBroom, and thank you all for joining us. And thank you for your commitment to being a witness of our social holiness, to being a witness of faith. And we look forward to seeing you at July 20th for our next conversation on the August recess, as well as the process of reconciliation. Thank you all, and we'll see you next time. That's it.